The cruelest invitations are the ones sent with a smile. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, slipped beneath the door of Claire Whitmore's small apartment just after sunrise. She noticed it when the pale light from the window touched the ivory paper on the floor. For a moment she simply stood there, barefoot on the cool wood, staring at the familiar handwriting written neatly across the front. Daniel Harper. Even after 3 years, the name still carried the faint echo of a life she had once believed would last forever. Claire bent down slowly and picked up the envelope. It was expensive stationery, thick and smooth, the kind Daniel used to insist on for every important occasion. Her fingers traced the edge before she opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation, formal, elegant, and impossibly cheerful. Daniel Harper and Olivia Bennett request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. The ceremony would be held at a luxury ballroom downtown, a place with chandeliers the size of small cars and marble floors polished like mirrors. Claire read the card once, then again. At the bottom of the invitation, beneath the printed script, there was a handwritten note in Daniel's unmistakable style. You should come. Maybe you'll finally see what a real marriage looks like. Claire did not gasp. She did not cry. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside, and the distant sound of a bus stopping at the corner. She simply held the card between her fingers, letting the silence stretch. 3 years ago Daniel Harper had ended their marriage with words that still echoed in every corner of her memory. He had said them calmly, almost kindly, as if delivering a fact no one could argue with. Claire, I deserve a future. I deserve a family. The whispers had already begun long before that conversation. His mother calling her a disappointment. Friends offering those soft, careful smiles people use when they think someone is broken. The word Barren had followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Claire had never argued. Not once. Even when the divorce papers were signed. Even when Daniel walked away convinced the failure of their marriage had a single, obvious reason. She had stayed silent. Because the truth would have destroyed him. Claire walked to the kitchen counter and set the invitation down beside her coffee mug. Outside the window, the city was waking up, cars sliding through intersections, people hurrying to work, the ordinary rhythm of a morning that belonged to everyone except her past. She looked at the card one more time. Daniel Harper was getting married again, and he wanted her there to watch it happen. Slowly, Claire folded the invitation and slipped it back into the envelope. Her reflection in the kitchen window looked calm, almost distant, like someone who had already lived through the worst part of the story. After a long moment, she whispered something so quietly the empty apartment barely heard it. 3 years, she said. Then she picked up her phone, staring at a single name on the screen. A man who knew the truth Daniel Harper never had. Alexander Hayes. Claire did not call Alexander Hayes immediately. The phone remained on the kitchen counter while the morning light climbed slowly across the apartment walls. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past and someone laughed on the sidewalk below. But inside the small space everything felt still, almost suspended in time. 3 years earlier, silence had followed Claire everywhere. It had begun the day Daniel Harper walked out of the fertility clinic with a tight smile and a hand on her shoulder, speaking in that calm voice he used whenever he wanted something to sound reasonable. The doctor had spoken carefully, using words like possibility and further testing, but Daniel had barely listened. By the time they reached the parking lot, he had already rewritten the story in his mind. Claire remembered the heat of that summer afternoon, the asphalt shimmering under the sun while Daniel leaned against the car and sighed as if carrying the weight of the entire future. He told her that some things were simply facts. He told her that every man deserved the chance to become a father. He told her that love could not change biology. Claire had stood beside him without arguing, watching the traffic move slowly through the intersection beyond the clinic. The truth had been folded quietly inside her purse in a sealed medical envelope that Daniel had never opened. The results from the second round of tests had come in that morning. Claire Whitmore was healthy. There was nothing wrong with her body, nothing that would prevent her from becoming a mother someday. The doctor had explained it gently, almost apologetically, while sliding another document across the desk. Daniel Harper, however, would never know that moment because he had stepped out of the room to answer a phone call before the final results were discussed. Claire had listened alone while the doctor spoke in careful language about biology and probabilities and a future that would look different than the one Daniel imagined. She had folded the report and slipped it into her purse before Daniel returned. He had never asked to see it. In the weeks that followed, the whispers from his family grew louder. His mother began speaking about grandchildren in the past tense, as if mourning something that had already died. Friends offered polite sympathy that felt more like quiet judgment. Daniel slowly pulled away, his disappointment shaping every conversation until the marriage felt like a house where all the lights had been turned off one by one. Claire had understood what would happen long before he asked for the divorce. What surprised her was not the ending but how easily the blame settled on her shoulders. She could have shown the medical report. She could have spoken the truth in a single sentence that would change everything. But she had looked at Daniel that night across the dining table and realized something simple. His pride mattered more to him than the truth. So she let the silence remain. The divorce was finalized on a gray morning in early November. Daniel signed the papers with a steady hand, convinced he was walking toward a better life. Claire walked out of the courthouse carrying only a small leather bag and the sealed envelope that held the truth about both of them. For months afterward she kept it tucked in the back of a drawer, untouched, like a secret chapter she had decided never to publish. Eventually she stopped thinking about Daniel Harper altogether. Life moved forward in quiet steps. A new apartment, a new job, a different part of the city where nobody knew her name or her past. Claire worked long hours and spoke little about herself. The world slowly grew larger again. And then, almost a year later, Alexander Hayes walked into the conference room on a rainy Monday morning. At that time Claire had known him only as the founder of the investment firm that owned the company where she worked. He was not the kind of man who filled a room with noise. Instead he observed people the way a careful reader studies a page, noticing details others overlooked. During that meeting Claire spoke for less than 3 minutes, explaining a research proposal that most executives had dismissed. When she finished, the room returned to its usual quiet routine, but Alexander Hayes continued watching her with thoughtful curiosity. After the meeting he stopped beside her chair and asked a single question in a calm voice that carried no judgment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "how did you learn to stay so composed when everyone else in this room had already decided you were wrong?" Claire had paused before answering. Years ago she might have explained everything. Instead she simply said that sometimes silence was the most powerful way to survive. Alexander Hayes smiled slightly, as if he understood more than she had actually said. That was the first conversation they ever had. Claire reached for her phone now, 3 years after the day Daniel Harper rewrote their story, and stared once again at Alexander Hayes's name glowing softly on the screen. Claire's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she finally pressed the call button. The phone rang once, then twice, the quiet sound echoing softly through the apartment. Alexander Hayes answered on the third ring. His voice carried the same calm steadiness she remembered from every conversation they had ever shared. "Good morning, Claire." There was no surprise in his tone, as if he had expected her call before the day even began. Claire glanced at the envelope still resting on the kitchen counter. The ivory paper looked harmless from a distance, but she knew exactly how much intention had been placed inside it. Daniel Harper had never done anything halfway. When he wanted to prove a point he made sure the whole world could see it. Claire exhaled slowly before speaking. "I received an invitation today," she said. "A wedding invitation." There was a brief pause on the line, not uncomfortable, simply thoughtful. Alexander Hayes had always been a man who allowed silence to do its work before responding. "I assume the groom is someone from your past," he said gently. Claire almost smiled. That was one of the reasons she trusted him. He never rushed people into explanations. "Yes," she said. "Daniel Harper is getting married next month." Another quiet pause followed. Through the kitchen window Claire could see the street below growing busier as commuters hurried toward the subway station 2 blocks away. Life moving forward the way it always did. "And he wants you to attend," Alexander said. Claire turned the invitation over in her hand. The handwriting on the envelope felt strangely familiar now, like an old photograph she had not looked at in years. "He did not only invite me," she said slowly. "He wrote a note encouraging me to come." Alexander did not laugh, but Claire could hear the faint change in his breathing that suggested he understood the situation immediately. "Some invitations are not meant as kindness," he said. "No," Claire replied softly. "They are not." The room grew quiet again. 3 years had passed since Claire Whitmore walked out of her old life with nothing but a small bag and a secret folded into a sealed medical envelope. During those years she had rebuilt herself piece by piece. The work had not been dramatic. There were no grand speeches or sudden victories. Just long days at the office, quiet evenings reading reports, and a steady determination to move forward without bitterness. Alexander Hayes had noticed that quiet strength from the very beginning. What began as occasional conversations after meetings slowly became something deeper. He trusted her judgment. He asked for her perspective on decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. Over time, Claire Whitmore became more than another analyst in the company. She became someone Alexander Hayes relied on. Yet despite the respect that grew between them, Claire had never told him the entire story about Daniel Harper. Not until today. He believed I could not give him a family, she said after a moment. That was the reason he ended the marriage. Alexander remained silent, listening carefully. Claire rested her hand against the kitchen counter, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingertips. The truth is something he never learned, she continued. The test results that day said the opposite. I was never the reason we could not have children. For a moment there was only the quiet hum of the city outside her window. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful weight. And you never corrected him. Claire shook her head even though he could not see it. No, she said. I let him keep the story he needed to believe. On the other end of the call, Alexander Hayes seemed to consider that answer carefully. Some people protect others with silence, he said at last. But silence also has a way of returning when the time is right. Claire looked again at the invitation in her hand. The elegant letters announcing Daniel Harper's new beginning now felt strangely small compared to the life she had built since leaving him behind. The wedding is in 4 weeks, she said. And I think he expects me to stay away. Alexander's response came without hesitation. Do you want to attend? Claire stood quietly for several seconds, listening to the distant sound of a subway train passing beneath the street. When she finally answered, her voice was calm. Yes, she said. Think I do. Another brief pause followed before Alexander Hayes spoke again. Then we should make sure you arrive properly, he said. Because sometimes the truth deserves an audience. Claire ended the call with Alexander Hayes and remained standing beside the kitchen counter for a long moment, the phone still resting lightly in her hand. The apartment around her was quiet, filled with the gentle light of late morning. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, taxis moving through intersections, people crossing streets with coffee cups in their hands, ordinary lives unfolding without interruption. 3 years ago, Claire Whitmore had walked away from everything she once believed defined her future. At the time, the world felt smaller, colder, as if every familiar place carried the echo of Daniel Harper's final words. In those early months, she had moved carefully through each day, not because she was broken, but because she was rebuilding something deeper than pride. She rented the small apartment where she now stood, a place only 600 square feet wide but filled with quiet independence. The furniture was simple, the walls nearly bare, but the space belonged entirely to her. Each morning she left before sunrise and took the subway downtown, the train rattling beneath the city while strangers sat beside her reading news on their phones. She never told anyone about the marriage that had ended or the accusation that followed her name. Instead, she focused on the one thing she could control: her work. At the investment firm, she studied reports others ignored, analyzing medical research projects and healthcare technologies that most executives dismissed as too complicated or too slow to produce profit. Claire approached each proposal with patience, reading every detail as if the future depended on understanding what others overlooked. Slowly her reputation grew. Colleagues began asking for her opinion during meetings. Managers trusted her with more responsibility. Yet through all of it, she remained the same quiet presence who preferred listening over speaking. The sealed medical report stayed hidden in a drawer beside her bed. Sometimes she forgot it existed. Other times she would see the edge of the envelope when she reached for something else, and remember the entire story in a single breath. She never opened it again, because the truth inside no longer defined her life. That was the version of Claire Whitmore Alexander Hayes first encountered. A woman who carried her past without displaying it, who spoke carefully but thought deeply. After that first meeting, he began inviting her to small discussions about projects others had already rejected. Claire noticed quickly that Alexander valued honesty more than presentation. He asked direct questions and listened closely to the answers. During one late afternoon meeting, he studied a report she had written and said something she had never forgotten. "You do not chase attention," he told her. "That usually means you understand something other people miss." From that moment forward, he began trusting her judgment in ways that surprised the rest of the office. Months turned into years, and Claire Whitmore gradually stepped into a role no one had originally planned for her. She helped guide decisions that shaped entire divisions of the company. Investors respected her analysis. Researchers appreciated her willingness to consider ideas that required patience instead of quick profit. Through all of it, Alexander Hayes remained the steady center of those conversations. He never treated her like someone who needed to prove her worth. Instead, he expected excellence from her the same way he expected it from himself. Now, standing in the quiet apartment with the wedding invitation still on the counter, Claire felt the strange distance between the woman she used to be and the one she had become. Daniel Harper had once believed her future was limited by a single assumption about her body. But the life she built afterward had expanded far beyond the narrow expectations he placed on her. Claire walked to the window and looked down at the street again. The sunlight, reflected off the glass buildings across the avenue, bright and steady. Somewhere in the city, Daniel Harper was preparing for a celebration that he believed would confirm the story he told the world about his past. Claire Whitmore closed her eyes for a brief moment and then reached for the invitation once more. 4 weeks remained before that wedding day arrived. 4 weeks before two versions of the same story would finally stand in the same room. 4 weeks can pass quickly when a person has something to prepare for, and Claire Whitmore understood that better than most people. The morning after her conversation with Alexander Hayes, she arrived at the office earlier than usual, stepping out of the subway station while the sky above the city was still pale with the first light of day. The streets were quieter at that hour. Delivery trucks idled beside coffee shops, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery on the corner, as Claire walked the final block toward the glass tower where the investment firm occupied several floors. 3 years earlier she had entered that building as a new employee, hoping only for a stable job and a quiet place to rebuild her life. Now the security guard at the front desk greeted her by name. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." Claire returned the greeting with a small nod and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the executive floor. The ride upward took less than 30 seconds, but it gave her just enough time to reflect on how much had changed since the woman Daniel Harper once dismissed as a disappointment first arrived here carrying nothing but determination. When the elevator doors opened, the office was still mostly empty. Sunlight poured through the tall windows that lined the hallway, stretching across polished floors and quiet desks. Claire walked toward the conference room where she often began her mornings, reviewing overnight reports from the company research teams. She had just placed her laptop on the table when the door opened again behind her. Alexander Hayes stepped inside, his suit jacket draped over one arm and a tablet in his other hand. He paused when he saw her already at work. "You are here earlier than usual," he said. Claire glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:30 in the morning. "I had trouble sleeping," she replied calmly. Alexander studied her expression for a moment, then placed his tablet on the table beside her laptop. "Most people lose sleep when they are worried," he said. "You do not look worried." Claire considered that observation carefully before answering. "I am not worried," she said. "I am thinking." Alexander Hayes nodded as if that made perfect sense. He moved to the window and looked out across the skyline where sunlight was beginning to reflect off dozens of glass buildings. "Weddings have a way of bringing old stories back into the present," he said thoughtfully. Claire did not respond right away. Instead, she opened the folder on her laptop containing several financial projections they had been analyzing the previous week. The numbers on the screen represented months of planning, negotiations, and research partnerships that would soon lead to one of the largest healthcare investment initiatives the firm had ever attempted. Daniel Harper had no idea how closely his life would soon intersect with those plans. Finally, Claire spoke again. "I do not intend to confront him," she said quietly. Alexander turned from the window. "I assumed as much," he replied. Claire Whitmore had never been someone who chased dramatic moments. Her strength came from patience and clarity rather than confrontation. Yet there was something different in her voice that morning, something steady and resolved. I simply believe that some stories deserve to end honestly, she continued. Alexander Hayes watched her carefully, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a slim document folder on the table between them. Claire recognized the envelope immediately even before he opened it. Inside was the same sealed medical report she had once hidden in a drawer years ago. I asked you for permission to retrieve this from your records last year, Alexander said calmly. You told me I could keep it safe until the day you might need it again. Claire looked down at the envelope, remembering the moment she had handed it to him during a quiet conversation long after they had begun trusting one another. She had not expected to see it again so soon. Do you believe that day has arrived? She asked softly. Alexander Hayes did not answer immediately. Instead he slid the envelope gently across the table toward her. I believe that truth is most powerful when it arrives quietly, he said. And sometimes the right room makes all the difference. Claire did not open the envelope immediately. It rested on the conference table between her and Alexander Hayes, thin and unremarkable, yet heavier than anything else in the room. For a moment she simply looked at it, remembering the day she first folded that document and chose silence over explanation. Outside the tall windows the city was fully awake now. Traffic moved in slow lines along the avenue below and sunlight spilled across the glass towers that surrounded them. Inside the quiet conference room time seemed to slow. Alexander did not rush her. He leaned back slightly in his chair and watched the skyline, giving Claire the same respect he always offered when a decision required patience. 3 years earlier Claire Whitmore had walked away from a marriage that ended with a single word attached to her name. Barren. The accusation had spread quickly among Daniel Harper's family and friends because it was simple and easy to believe. Nobody had asked questions. Nobody had considered that silence might mean something entirely different from guilt. Claire had carried that silence quietly while building a new life that no longer depended on correcting the past. Yet now the sealed report sat on the table again, returned from the place where she had hidden it for so long. Claire finally reached forward and rested her hand on the envelope. The paper felt cool beneath her fingers. It is strange, she said softly, how one piece of paper can change an entire story. Alexander turned his attention back toward her. Stories do not change because of paper, he replied calmly. They change because someone decides the truth deserves to be heard. Claire looked down at the envelope again but did not open it. For years she had imagined what might happen if Daniel Harper ever learned the truth. At first she believed it would feel like victory. Later she realized it would only feel like closure. There was no anger left inside her now. Only clarity. Daniel Harper had made his decisions based on the version of reality he chose to accept. Claire had made hers based on protecting someone who never asked to be protected. Do you think it will matter? She asked quietly. Alexander did not misunderstand the question. Whether the truth changes his life, he said, is not something you can control. But whether it changes yours is entirely up to you. Claire nodded slowly. That was the kind of answer she expected from him. Alexander Hayes had built his reputation in the business world by understanding that power often came from timing rather than force. He did not rush events. He waited until the moment was undeniable. The wedding invitation still sat folded inside Claire's bag on the table beside her laptop. For weeks remained before Daniel Harper stood in front of hundreds of guests promising a future he believed had finally replaced the past. Claire lifted the envelope and turned it over once in her hands. The seal remained unbroken. She already knew what was written inside. Medical terminology, clinical language, the quiet certainty of numbers and biological facts that Daniel Harper had never seen. She set the envelope back down again. I will bring it with me, she said. Alexander nodded as if that decision had been expected all along. The room fell quiet for a few seconds before he spoke again. The ballroom where the ceremony will be held is owned by one of our partner companies, he said casually. Claire looked up slightly surprised. Alexander Hayes allowed a faint smile to appear, the kind that suggested he had been considering the details of this situation for longer than she realized. It is a beautiful place, he continued. Large windows, high ceilings, and excellent acoustics. Perfect for an evening celebration. Claire studied his expression carefully. You have already arranged something, she said. Alexander did not deny it. I have arranged an opportunity, he replied calmly. The rest depends entirely on you. Claire Whitmore looked once more at the envelope on the table. Then she placed it carefully inside her bag beside the wedding invitation. For the first time since receiving that ivory card beneath her apartment door, she felt no hesitation at all about the night that was coming. The wedding day arrived quietly, without drama, as if the city itself did not realize that two very different versions of the past were about to stand in the same room. By early evening the ballroom downtown glowed with warm golden light that spilled through tall windows overlooking the river. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting soft music drifting through the air while guests in formal suits and elegant dresses filled the polished marble floor with conversation and laughter. Daniel Harper stood near the front of the room beside his groomsmen, adjusting the cuff of his jacket while a photographer moved around them capturing the final moments before the ceremony. To most people watching, Daniel looked exactly like a man who had rebuilt his life perfectly. His posture was confident, his smile relaxed, and his future seemed clearly arranged beside the woman waiting in the bridal suite upstairs. Olivia Bennet had the kind of beauty magazines often described as effortless. Tall, graceful, with a bright laugh that carried easily across a crowded room. Many of the guests believed Daniel Harper was fortunate to begin again with someone so admired. Among those guests were several familiar faces from Daniel's past. Former colleagues, friends from college, and a few members of his extended family who had supported him during the difficult months after his first marriage ended. They spoke comfortably about the future, about how life always improved when the right choices were finally made. One of Daniel's cousins stood near the bar explaining to another guest that Daniel had once married a woman who could not give him a family. It had been unfortunate, he said with a sympathetic shake of his head, but sometimes people simply were not meant to stay in your life forever. The music shifted slightly as a string quartet near the windows began playing a slower arrangement of a familiar melody. Guests continued arriving, their voices blending together beneath the chandeliers. No one noticed the quiet black sedan pulling to the curb outside the entrance. The driver stepped out first and opened the rear door with careful precision. Claire Whitmore emerged from the car with calm, deliberate movements. The evening air carried a soft breeze from the river, gently lifting a strand of her hair as she straightened to her full height. She wore a simple black evening dress that moved gracefully with each step, elegant without drawing unnecessary attention. In her hand she carried a small silver clutch that held two items placed there earlier that morning. The folded wedding invitation and a sealed medical envelope that had waited 3 years for this moment. On the other side of the car, Alexander Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk. His presence had a quiet authority that rarely required introduction. Anyone familiar with the world of finance would recognize him immediately as the founder of one of the most influential healthcare investment firms in the country. Yet tonight he appeared not as a distant executive, but as a calm companion walking beside Claire Whitmore toward the glowing entrance of the ballroom. As they approached the doors, the sound of music and conversation grew clearer. Claire paused briefly at the top of the steps leading inside. Through the glass she could see the reflections of dozens of guests moving beneath the chandeliers. Somewhere inside that room Daniel Harper believed the past had already been buried. Alexander Hayes glanced toward her, his voice low and steady. "Are you certain you wish to go through with this?" Claire's gaze remained on the ballroom doors. 3 years earlier she had walked away from a different doorway with nothing but silence protecting the truth. Tonight she carried something else entirely. Not anger, not revenge, but clarity. "Yes," she answered softly. Alexander Hayes gave a single nod and reached forward to open the door. Warm light spilled onto the steps as the music from inside filled the evening air. And in that quiet moment before stepping into the room, Claire Whitmore felt something she had not expected. Not fear, not hesitation. Only the calm certainty that the story everyone believed was about to change. The ballroom doors opened and Claire Whitmore stepped inside beside Alexander Hayes. The music continued for several seconds before anyone noticed them. A soft violin melody drifting beneath the chandeliers while waiters moved quietly between guests carrying silver trays of champagne. Then slowly conversations began to pause. At first it was only a few people near the entrance who turned their heads. A woman in a dark green dress stopped mid-sentence while speaking to a colleague. One of Daniel Harper's former co-workers glanced toward the door and blinked twice as if uncertain he had recognized the woman correctly. Claire Whitmore had not been seen in this circle of people for 3 years. Yet there she was, walking calmly across the marble floor with quiet confidence, her black dress catching the warm light from above. She did not hurry. She did not search the room for anyone. She simply walked forward as if she belonged there, Alexander Hayes moving beside her with the same composed presence that had made his name familiar to investors and executives across the country. Several guests recognized him immediately. A man near the bar whispered something to the person standing beside him, and within seconds a ripple of curiosity spread quietly through the crowd. The founder of Hayes Strategic Investments was not someone people expected to see attending a private wedding, unless there was a very specific reason. Daniel Harper noticed the shift in attention before he saw the cause of it. He turned slightly toward the entrance, his expression relaxed at first, assuming another group of guests had arrived late. Then his eyes found Claire Whitmore standing beneath the chandeliers. For a moment Daniel did not move at all. The smile he had been wearing slowly faded, as if someone had turned down the brightness of a light. Claire stopped several steps inside the room. She could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her now. Curiosity mixing with recognition among guests who had heard fragments of a story that once defined her life. Daniel Harper walked toward her. His expression controlled but clearly surprised. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying a polite tone that did not quite hide the tension beneath it. "I did not expect you to accept the invitation." Claire's reply was calm. "You encouraged me to come," she said gently. Daniel glanced briefly toward Alexander Hayes standing beside her. Recognition arrived quickly. Daniel had seen Alexander's name often enough in financial news reports and industry briefings to understand exactly who he was. "Mr. Hayes," Daniel said carefully, extending his hand out of habit more than confidence. Alexander Hayes shook his hand with polite courtesy. "Congratulations on your wedding," he replied. Around them the surrounding guests had begun to listen openly now, conversations fading into quiet observation. Olivia Bennet had appeared at the edge of the crowd as well, her expression curious as she watched the unexpected exchange unfolding only a few steps away from the ceremony space. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, trying to restore the comfortable atmosphere of celebration he had expected for this evening. "Claire, I hope you understand the invitation was simply a gesture of closure," he said. "The past belongs where it is." Claire studied his face calmly. "That may be true," she said softly. "But sometimes the past contains information that never had the chance to be heard." Daniel's expression tightened just slightly. Alexander Hayes reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a slim envelope. The same envelope Claire had placed inside her bag earlier that morning. He did not hand it to Claire. Instead he extended it directly toward Daniel Harper. "This belongs to a conversation that should have happened years ago," Alexander said in his steady voice. Daniel looked down at the envelope with confusion. Several guests leaned closer without realizing they were doing it. The room had grown almost completely silent beneath the chandeliers. Daniel accepted the envelope slowly, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the sealed paper. "What is this?" he asked. Claire Whitmore met his eyes for the first time that evening. "Something you never asked to read," she replied quietly. Daniel Harper looked down at the envelope in his hand as if the thin layer of paper had suddenly become heavier than it should have been. The ballroom remained silent around him, the soft music from the string quartet fading uncertainly as the musicians realized that something unexpected was unfolding in the center of the room. Guests stood still beneath the chandeliers, watching the small moment with quiet curiosity that slowly turned into focused attention. Daniel turned the envelope over once, noticing the seal had never been opened. For several seconds he did not move. Then, almost cautiously, he broke the seal and slid the document from inside. The paper unfolded with a quiet sound that seemed louder than it should have in the silent ballroom. His eyes moved across the page, scanning the medical terminology and printed results that had been recorded 3 years earlier in a clinic office he barely remembered visiting. At first his expression showed only confusion, then something changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly. The color in his face shifted as the meaning of the words began to settle into place. The document explained the test results clearly. Claire Whitmore had never been unable to have children. The medical report confirmed that her health had been normal. The problem, as written plainly in clinical language, had been identified elsewhere. Daniel Harper read the line twice as if hoping the words might change the second time. They did not. Around him the room remained quiet, though a few guests exchanged uncertain glances. Olivia Bennet stood several feet away watching Daniel's face with growing concern. Daniel slowly lowered the document and looked up at Claire. For the first time that evening, the confidence he had worn so comfortably seemed to disappear completely. "You knew about this," he said, his voice quieter than before. Claire Whitmore met his gaze without anger. "Yes," she answered gently. "The doctor explained it to me the same day." Daniel looked back at the paper again, as if searching for some explanation that would restore the version of history he had carried for so long. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. Claire considered the question for a moment before replying. "Because you had already decided what you believed," she said calmly. "And I saw how important that belief was to you." A few guests nearby lowered their eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with the realization that the story they had accepted for years had never been complete. Daniel Harper remained still in the center of the ballroom, the document trembling slightly in his hand. Everything he had built his certainty on now felt uncertain. The silence stretched across the room until Alexander Hayes spoke quietly beside Claire. "Some truths arrive late," he said. "But they still arrive." Daniel did not respond. Claire watched him for a moment longer, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with a calm understanding that surprised even herself. 3 years earlier she had walked away carrying the weight of someone else's pride. Tonight she no longer carried it. She reached into her clutch and removed the folded wedding invitation, placing it gently on the nearby table beside Daniel. "I came because you asked me to witness your new beginning," she said softly. "Now you have seen the truth about the ending of the old one." Daniel looked at her again, but Claire had already stepped back. Alexander Hayes offered a polite nod toward the stunned guests before turning toward the entrance. Claire walked beside him across the marble floor, the quiet crowd parting slightly to let them pass. No one tried to stop them. Outside the ballroom the evening air felt cool and peaceful compared to the heavy silence inside. Alexander opened the car door as the city lights reflected across the river nearby. Claire paused for a moment and looked back at the glowing windows of the ballroom where the story she once lived had finally finished telling itself. She did not feel anger. She did not feel regret. Only a quiet sense of freedom that had taken 3 years to fully arrive. Then she stepped into the car, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.